All right, hello everybody. Today I've got something for you that I hope you will find interesting. I just finished reading, not just finished, but like a week ago I finished reading a book called The Object, Hard Science Fiction. It's a book by Joshua T. Calvert. I've got some notes here so I don't miss anything. But yeah, I figured I would just do kind of a little bit of a review of it and kind of tell you guys what I thought, and hopefully that would help you decide whether this is something you want to look at and kind of give you a little bit of an insight into like what I look for in science fiction. So, why did I pick this book? You probably never heard of it. You may have never heard of the author either. I certainly hadn't either. But what I basically did was I had this idea that I could maybe do some like market research about hard science fiction. And so what I did is I just stupidly, naively went to Amazon and said, what are the top 5 best-selling hard science fiction, specifically hard science fiction books that are selling on Kindle these days? And, well, The Object, hard science fiction, was one of those 5 top books. I've only bought that one so far. I'm going to buy the other 4 and go through them and do reviews of them, I guess, assuming that they're worth talking about. But kind of the initial drive was market research, and so that's why I picked this one. It has a very simple cover. It has a very simple title. It has kind of a bludgeony title. Like, did you really need to put hard science fiction in the title of your book? I don't know, but there it was. And so I picked it up and I read it, and oof. I mean, unfortunately, I gotta say I found it kind of bland and not very engaging. I'm going to try to minimize spoilers in this review because I don't want to. I'm not doing like an in-depth, Mahler-style examination of the book with the assumption that you've read it. I'm trying to give you my opinions of it without spoiling everything in it, so that you will, so that you can decide whether you want to look into it or not. But yeah, it did not grip me really. So the structure of the book is basically 3 parts. The first roughly third of the book is about tracking this object that appears in the solar system, and is kind of flying in on some kind of weird trajectory, going to pass through the solar system. It's reminiscent of that Oumuamua thing from a few years ago, or actually it reminded me a lot of Rendezvous with Rama. The second part of the book is about kind of getting ready to go to the object and flying there. And then the third part of the book is about their time spent on the object, the crew that gets there. I mean, the thing that this book did for me basically is it kind of made me nostalgically recall reading Rendezvous with Rama maybe 10, 12 years ago. And so I'm going to make some comparisons throughout the review. Since Rendezvous with Rama is an old book, I'm going to probably spoil a little bit of that. I'm going to try not to spoil too much, but I'm going to be talking about concepts, and I got to have a little bit of, concreteness in the concepts. And so, if you want, Rama's a short book. It's only about 60,000 words. So if you want to go pick up Rama and read it and then come back to this review, I won't blame you. Reading this book made me want to read Rama again, and I did, like yesterday. The whole thing. So, talking about the object again, the main character, she's okay. Melody something or other. The problem is that in the first third of the book, Calvert spends way too much time having her do her influencer thing. She's kind of like a media personality. She's got qualifications. She's not like some kind of crazy, Mary Sue character or anything like that. Not that, but she's got her own, weaknesses and stuff. But one of the things that she's good at is talking to the media, giving lectures and stuff like that. And so a good chunk of the first third of the book is about her doing that kind of stuff. And that stuff is mostly pretty dull. I found myself wanting to skim through a good chunk of it, because it was just a person talking in the most generalized basic terms about this kind of thing to a lay audience, And so it wasn't really interesting from like a hard sci-fi perspective. One thing about hard sci-fi is that you got to kind of know your audience. The hard sci-fi audience is not, a layman science audience. The hard sci-fi audience typically knows a decent amount about this or that, and so you can talk up to them a little bit if you want, and probably you should, because otherwise they're going to find it boring. Yeah, there was just too much time spent with these media appearances and stuff, and there wasn't anything interesting there. Just to kind of compare, it would have been way more interesting to have her spending a lot more time interacting with other scientists, speculating about the science behind this object, really filling out the details of that. What it is, where it's going, what it's doing. There is some of that, but it's very dryly written, and it's almost always written as like, this is what it is, and there's very little argument. One of the things I wanted to mention is that, well, I'll do it later. Most of the other characters are pretty forgettable, and that's okay. Like in hard sci-fi, it's not always true that the characters are really the outstanding part. What you kind of want to definitely aim for are not necessarily new, but interesting ideas, and mixing them together in a novel way if you can. Most of the characters in the book are pretty forgettable, and they don't get a lot of development, honestly. There's very little character development beyond a little bit of back and forth dialogue between them, and not much going on, as opposed to, say, Rama, where there was... Again, the characters, like the names were forgettable in Rama, but you can kind of, if you've read Rama recently, you can be like, oh, I remember that guy. There was the commander. There was the guy who did this. There was the guy who did that. There was the guy who had the air bicycle. There was the guy who like followed the space Jesus religion. There was the scientist on Luna who had to kind of like answer questions from them about certain things about Rama. In this one, there's not really a whole lot of that going on. It's mostly... this is what we see, and this is what it is, and that's kind of unsatisfying from a sci-fi perspective. Like, and there wasn't a lot of character development because you can get around it the other way too. You can get around having not a whole lot of scientific stuff by having really cool character interactions, and that wasn't here either, unfortunately. It was weird because Mel was the main character. And the story was mostly told from a third-person perspective with her as kind of like the POV character-ish, right? And the problem with the way that was done is that with a consistent third person, what you could and maybe should be doing is getting into the minds of at least a couple of characters and exploring them in interesting ways, either what they think about something or how they feel about other characters. If you're going to just focus on one character's POV for the whole book, for the most part, you could write it in first-person perspective, and you could get a lot more feel for Mel's character. In the Derelict Project books that I've written, they're all written in first-person perspective, with the exception of some bits of the upcoming novel. And the reason I do that is because you can get the main character's opinions on things, and it sounds and flows and feels very natural. As opposed to, in this case, where you have most of it from the POV of one character, but it's all in a very bland kind of third person without a lot of real emotion or spirit to it. And like, just because it's hard science fiction doesn't mean that the people involved don't have emotions and ambitions and foibles and stuff. And so you really got to bring some of that in, and there's not much of it in the book. There's like a couple of examples, and they're pretty weak sauce. I mean, it's a what do you call it? It's like a stereotype, right? That you get scientists and they call everything engineering, but that's what I'm going to do here, unfortunately. Much of what you get in the object that's supposedly hard science fiction is really engineering. It's like how astronauts train for going into space. It's the details of orbital mechanics, which are well-known equations that everybody knows, and and they aren't particularly interesting. There's a couple of places where they throw in some like, engineering or scientific jargon, but there's really not a whole lot to it. Unfortunately, there's really only two really interesting ideas in the object. One of them is what the object really is, which is a cool idea, and I like, with a couple of little reservations, how Calvert came up with the idea of what the object is and how he handled it. And then there's a thing in there about a method for instantaneous communication, which I won't say too much about, other than, it is important to the end of the story. It would have been nicer if it had been more integrated into the earlier parts of the story, which would have been a little bit more difficult, I admit, but maybe should have been done. By comparison, Rendezvous with Rama is like General Tso's chicken. It's full of ideas, and if you don't get that reference, that's fine. But like, I just kind of, off the top of my head, I wasn't even looking at the book. I kind of wrote down a list of the ideas that are in Rendezvous with Rama that are interesting from a science fiction perspective. The super chimps, the planetary alliance, the details of the Mercury colony, the architecture of Rama, including the staircases, the layout, the activation of Rama, the space guard concept. Not super amazing now, but back when Clark was writing, it was a neat idea. The idea of this low-G air bike sport appearing when you have all these other planets with low gravity, you can do different things. And, there were hints of like how society is organized. Planned families, yet there was still polygamy, yet there was still Malthusian population control. It was, a lot of science fiction writers smuggle in that kind of political stuff. It's not too bad in Rama, and it's not present pretty much at all in the object either, which is nice. And then there was the space drive, which is kind of the other big thing in Rama. I'm sure I'm missing some ideas that are in Rama, but like, I'm already listing 8. More if you break up the architecture of Rama into multiple things, because it is multiple things, as opposed to this one that was kind of 2. Maybe, So, I mean, and I have to forgive the object to a certain degree, because part of its problem is that it's near future, or like contemporary sci-fi. It happens about now, which does make it harder to do things like the sweeping futurism that we see in Rama and in a lot of other classic sci-fi. But that's only really a partial excuse, right? For instance, in the object's path, it could have done more things or more mysterious things as it was moving through the earlier parts of the story, as people were tracking it. There could have been more linkage. I mentioned this before, but there could have been more linkage of the instantaneous communication idea throughout the story, as opposed to kind of backloading it all at the end. They could have had more scientific questioning about the nature and actions of the object. They could have had more creative ideas for the intercepting spacecraft. In the book, it's kind of just like, oh, it's a SpaceX thing. Elon Musk makes an appearance to say basically nothing. The thing about the object is that, like, if you don't have a lot of really cool ideas, you got to kind of get through with your character interactions, which is kind of the way that I'm working on with my Derelict project stuff, right? If you look at Missed Contact, there's a hard sci-fi background, right? But I'm not like coming up with all kinds of really crazy ideas. I've got a couple, and they're kind of like, they're far in the background. The real meat of the story is the character interactions and the mystery. Usually, they're not really, my stuff isn't really. They're not really sci-fi stories because they're not focused on these ideas. They're actually more like Nero Wolfe mysteries, kind of, sort of, with a sci-fi background, which, I mean, I can't help it. I just have to. Nero Wolfe goes into everything. But anyway, with the object, the character interactions were kind of dry and bland for the most part. Like, there's very little emotional back and forth between characters. And then, when they weren't dry and bland, they got obnoxious. They're in, like, the second part of the book. There's this astronaut quiz thing that they do for some reason. And, oh my god, like, as a scientist, it had me both, like, gagging and cringing at the same time. Because all it was they would ask these questions of, like, wildly varying difficulty. And then the astronauts, candidates, would give these weirdly verbatim from the textbook answers for these things. And it was also like a drinking game, but like the drinking game element of it was so like bleh that it was like barely there. But like, if someone asks you what the definition of pH, you won't say, no human being will say what the guy in the object said about how you define pH. Because people in normal conversation don't use the word decadic at all. It's just not a thing, right? You would find that word in a textbook, but like even an astronaut, even a highly trained astronaut or a highly trained scientist would be hard-pressed to come up with the word decadic to describe what you do to the logarithm in order to get the number for pH out of the concentration of hydronium ions, right? Like there was some really hard questions, and then there were some really like simple math questions, and it's kind of obvious to me that the author didn't really have a good grasp of what makes a difficult mathematical problem. It was an integral with an exponential in it, which chain rule, right? I mean, I could almost do it in my head if I really thought about it, but I don't care to. And that part of the book was so obnoxious that I kind of skipped it. Like, I mean, I didn't skip it, but I skimmed through it pretty quickly because it was just like really painful to listen to these characters reciting these, like robotic definitions or answers to problems and making it into some like really like awkward competition. It didn't flow well. I did not like it at all. And I'm going to go back to Rendezvous with Rama. In Rendezvous with Rama, when a scientific question gets asked, it's something about the story. It's something about Rama. And the characters who are all looking at this problem in different, from different perspectives, they disagree and they're like, well, maybe it's this, or maybe it's that, or maybe it's this. Oh, that sounds interesting. Maybe it's that. But let me take that idea, a little step in this direction, and we can talk about that. There's a lot of that back and forth between intelligent people in Rama. I mean, the object has almost no actual arguments about these observations that they're making about what they might mean. Whereas in real life, if you show a video that scientists have never seen to 10 different scientists, and you ask them to explain what the hell is happening in this video, and it's something that they've never seen before, you might not get 10 different answers, but you might get 6, right? You might get an answer from a geological perspective. You might get a physics perspective. You might get a biological perspective, and even the physics perspective, you might say, well, there's an electromagnetic, reason for this, or this could be, gravitational effect, or there could be a changing frame of reference thing going on, like a Coriolis force or something. There's lots of this kind of argument and speculation in Rama, and there's almost none in the object. For instance, there's early in the book, the object passes behind Saturn and it appears to stop and then start again. It's incredibly poorly handled because most of what they're talking about is like, oh, I'm devastated that it's gone. It must have crashed, or like, there it is, and it started back up again. Yay, we still have a thing to track. And it's like, you should have been spending time talking about, like, first off, like, it seemed it wasn't described well enough, because like they're like, well, if it goes into Saturn's gravity well, it can't get back out. It's like, no, that's not how orbital mechanics works, because all the potential energy that it gets getting closer to Saturn came from it being out at infinity, and so it has all that energy to convert it back into kinetic, right? So it either crashes or it doesn't. What they should have been talking about is like, oh, if it actually goes into Saturn's atmosphere, the drag forces are going to cut out, this, and they're also going to produce forces that are. There was no mention of that, and I knew what was going to happen, but it was so vague that unless you had done this kind of, unless you had my kind of background, you might miss it and just be like, I don't get it. I guess it falls in. That's not how it works. That behind Saturn event is really poorly handled because it's mostly like, what did, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's like, what did YouTube think of the thing disappearing behind his head? Or it's like, no, get some people who know what they're talking about on the horn and have them argue about it. That'd be way more interesting. But they didn't do that. Yeah, it's one of those things where the object spends a ton of time on engineering minutia and very little on the actual intriguing points. It's worth noting that the only part of the book that they're on the object is the last third of the book, approximately. Whereas in Rendezvous with Rama, they get to it quick, like 4 chapters or something like that, a couple thousand words in. It's not... they have a couple of questions about like what it is on the way through, and they talk about how they're measuring its rotational thing in Rama. In the object, they spend very little time talking about the actual object, a lot of time talking to other people about the object in layman's terms, and then like a lot of time spent on like the prep and training for astronauts, which is detailed and interesting. But interesting is a strong word. It's detailed, but kind of boring. It's kind of like it's like. Have you ever read one of those books from NASA published about like the space shuttle and all the protocols for running the space shuttle? If you've ever seen a book like that, you know that it's kind of intriguing, right? Intriguing, yeah, and it's like cool to see. But at the same time, it's very dry and very boring, and there's not much going on, and there's a ton of fluff of like, oh, we're in the low mass chamber with the water and the blah, 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 whatever. In Rama, they're really clear about how it is that they find a way to land on Rama, considering what Rama is and how it's moving. In the object, it's really vague. Like, first off, in the first part of the book, they seem to describe the object as like a spinning disc, that's wider than it is long, right? And it's rotating along an axis. And so it kind of, when I was reading the early part of the object, I was like, oh, it's like a disc ship, a disc UFO ship kind of shape. Obviously not like smooth, but something like that. And then when they get to it, they describe it as potato-shaped, which I don't remember him justifying that change. Like, we did some observations, and that should have been mentioned if there was a change in... Like, you could do it. You could say, oh, because of the motion or the angle of attack of our camera on the thing, we thought it was disc-shaped, but actually it's pretty standard asteroid-shaped, something like that. But like the landing part is also really kind of vague and not very well described. How they managed to lock themselves into place with all of that centrifugal force to deal with, to avoid throwing them off of the thing. Because the way that it's described, it sounds like they land on the side of it, and like I guess they just have these harpoons. I don't know. Calvert has the tendency, it seems, to kind of go vague when he doesn't know a great answer to a scientific or engineering problem. And that's a problem, too, because you need to at least creatively think of an answer to these problems to satisfy the kinds of people who read hard science fiction. Let's see. One of the cool things in the story is also really poorly described. They cut into the object with a water cutter, like a pressurized water jet cutter, and they don't explain very well how it works in vacuum without consuming tons and tons and tons and tons of water, or even, and so it would have been really cool if they're like, oh yeah, it has these things that allow it to recirculate the vapor that sprays out from the material and it has filters. Like, you could have gone into detail on that, but there's just not detail on it, and it was a little bit. Yeah, I would really like to know how. I would really have liked to know how that would work, as opposed to using something like a arc welder or something to cut through, like a laser cutter or something. There's a point near the end of the story where the object does something that affects the character's outlook on their near future. I don't want to spoil it, but based on the way that they describe how things work in the object, that thing that it does seems to happen way faster than you would expect it to happen. And there's the fact that nobody was watching for this thing to happen, that, that could potentially, injure or kill them. nobody was watching? Really? Seriously? I feel like they probably would have been, and that it couldn't have happened as fast as it did in the story. Yeah, the other... So what I will say is that what the object is, the details of what it is and what it represents, those are actually that's actually a pretty neat idea. I liked that. It was cool to get a little bit of the detail about what it was, how its internal workings operated, things like that. So I did like that about the book. That's definitely... If you want to know what the object is, you should go read it. But know that you're going to want to skip, like, the first 2/3 of the book. The other fresh idea was this instantaneous communication thing. And the way it's presented is pretty dull, honestly. Like, it doesn't really... There's not really any, like, oh, this does this because of this. It's just like, maybe it's this, and then there's the very end where it's like, yeah, it's this. It's like, okay, well, that doesn't really, you know, they could have really explored what instantaneous communication does to humanity, and they did not. There's some very vague stuff in, like, the last chapter, but it suffers from, like, super short ending syndrome, which is unfortunately something that we get these days. Other thing, there are characters who get injured and killed in the story. So nobody's invincible, which is nice. But at the same time, the handling of these injuries and deaths is very Spockian. Nobody really... There's, like, a little bit of reaction to it, but not much. It's very subdued. For characters that, you know, supposedly have spent a lot of time together and stuff like that, they just don't really react to it that much. And that's another trend in modern media, too, is that when somebody dies, nobody mourns. Or the mourning is all off screen, so to speak, right? Like, and that's just, oh God, I hate that trend. You know, the important parts of a character are when they have to react to, you know, strong stimuli. And just hiding that as like, oh, well, you know, he mourned. Of course, he just mourned about it. It was, you know, he was sad. And now he's fine. It's just like, oh, it's such a missed opportunity in a lot of media these days. So that kind of is my discussion of the object, hard science fiction. Length comparison. Rama. Rendezvous with Rama, just the first book, packs a ton into about 60,000 words. The object does very little in 100K. Rama's language at the very beginning, and throughout, but especially at the beginning, was like almost poetry. Like, those first couple of chapters by Clark in Rama are like, whew, I want to read more of this. This flows beautifully. And even though it was all like in like the passive voice in like the first couple of chapters of Rama, it was still like really beautifully written. And I did not get any feeling of the beauty of the writing in the object, which, you know, parts of it I wanted to skim or skip. So that's my thoughts. Final recommendation: if you are starving for a story that has a couple of interesting sci-fi ideas, but is mostly an engineering story, give it a look. I'll put a link. Not like it won't even be like a what do you call it? I don't have a whatchamacallit account yet, so I couldn't if I wanted to. But like an affiliate link, I'll just put an Amazon link in the thing. I don't think you can click it yet because my account is still too new, and I'm not going to send them my freaking ID. But at some point, that link will be clickable, or you can just copy paste it, whatever. Anyway, I'll put a link in the description to this and to Rama, so you can compare them if you feel like it too. And yeah, you know, if you really want some hard sci-fi, a little bit of hard sci-fi with a lot of engineering, and you don't really care about character development that much, you could try it. But if you want something that will like really grip you as a novel, unfortunately, I have to kind of say give it a pass. And of course, you know what? You know, if you think my opinions are stupid here, or if you think not even necessarily opinions, but if you think my conclusions are wrong, feel free to go check it out and let me know what parts of the book you actually found really gripping. I would love to get more information on that from people. but yeah, that's the object. I would say I don't know what demand it is serving, because it was not fun to read. And even hard science fiction needs to be fun to read, because unless you have the best, most unexplored, novel, beautiful scientific idea that no one has ever come up with, you're going to need to augment that with some interesting characters to make a novel out of it. And, to my dismay, I didn't get that feeling from the object. So, yeah, I hope I've given you guys enough to kind of make your decision without spoiling too much of the story, because I don't want to spoil the story. I want people to, if people want to go read it, then go read it. Prove me wrong, right? I mean, the market already has proved me wrong. It's one of the best-selling hard science fiction stories on the thing. And it wasn't just like it was up for like a week, because I just checked it yesterday, and it's still up there. So like it's good selling for hard sci-fi. So maybe this is what people want. I'm just crazy. But maybe I'm crazy like a fox. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. If you want to go check it out and read it and put a comment in and tell me that I'm wrong and what part of the book was the best that you think, go for it. If you come down with the same conclusion that I have, feel free to drop me a comment as well. And you can comment either on the YouTube video itself, or I'm going to put this into a blog post as well. So that's all I've got for you guys for now. So hopefully that will help you decide whether or not to buy this very popular, very good-selling hard science fiction book. The other ones on hard sci-fi are all like the Murderbot Diaries, which I've heard are good, and I'm probably going to try one of those next. But like they seem more tongue-in-cheek than hard sci-fi, but I guess I'll have to see. Anyway, that's all I've got for now. Yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you next time.